Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Backyard Bounty. I'm your host, Nicole, and today I'm really excited to do something a little bit different for this episode. Today I'm doing a listener Q&A. So I reached out to the wonderful folks that listen to the podcast, and I asked for you guys to submit your questions for the show, and I got about 11 or 12 wonderful questions about backyard chicken keeping, and I'm really excited to answer your questions today. Hopefully this episode will be useful for you. And hopefully this is something that we can start doing more episodes in the future. So this episode, in addition to being available on all of the podcast players, will also be available on our YouTube channel. So please check that out. Please subscribe to it. I know that you probably are tired of hearing about that from folks that are on YouTube, but honestly, subscribing to our channel actually really does help and helps the channel grow. So you can find me over there. The channel is called Heritage Acres Market. And then, of course, it'll be on your podcast players. And if you'd like to submit a question for a future Q&A, you can do so by going to my website, heritageacresmarket.com. Click on the podcast tab and scroll down, and you'll see a way to submit your question via SpeakPipe. SpeakPipe is super easy. It's you can do it on your phone, on the Safari browser. I'm not sure about Android, but I'm sure there's a way you can do it on there, or you can do it on the computer. It's just a real simple way to submit your questions for the show, and then I can include them and answer them on a future Q&A episode. So please submit your questions over there, and as long as the questions keep coming in, I will keep releasing these Q&As. So to get started here, our first question here is from Eliza, and here is Eliza's question.
Hi, my name's Eliza, and I have a brooder lighting related question. So I'm using a radiant heater that doesn't give off visible light, but I put a dim amber light bulb over the brooder just to make sure the chicks can find their feeder and water okay. I've read that too much artificial light can cause chickens to develop too quickly, so I'm wondering, is it okay to provide continuous supplemental lighting for chicks? Or is there either a recommended duration of darkness or maybe just an age at which I should switch off this artificial light entirely?
So thank you, Eliza, so much for that question. This was actually a really good question, and I did some research to be able to give you the best possible answer here. And the University of Maine has an article titled Maine Poultry Facts, Lighting for Small-Scale Flocks. And I just wanted to read you the snippet from there and what they have to say about it, and I think it should answer your question. So their article says, if chicks are brooded during winter months, you may find it necessary to keep brooder lights or heat lamps on for longer than the usual 4-week period. Some might worry about the effect of this extended light on subsequent sexual maturity. As long as the light is cut back before the chicks reach 8 weeks of age, there should be no adverse effect. And I'll, of course, include that link for you to read more on. So basically, you're okay as long as you reduce that light before they reach 8 weeks of age. Shouldn't be an issue. In fact, the article does go on to say that when they're young, the light needs to be on for 24 hours a day for the first couple days, and then on at least 12 hours a day following that, so that they can find their food and water. So sounds like you're doing everything great. Just about before 8 weeks of age, I'd cut that light back. So our next question is from Rammi in the UK.
My chickens have stopped giving eggs for the last 2-3 months. Is it because of cold? And if it is, what can we do to make things better? I'm in the UK. Thank you. Bye.
So I know, Rammi, you are in the UK, but this is a common question everywhere right now, here in the United States as well. So a little bit of, background information on egg production to answer your question. So while the cold is a stressor, and anything that stresses chickens will reduce their egg laying, it's not necessarily the cold that's causing the decrease in egg production, but the amount of light. So chickens need 14 to 15 hours of daylight, and that's what triggers the hormones in their body to produce eggs, to release the egg and go on through egg production. So during the winter months, of course, there's less daylight. Unfortunately, we're all familiar with that. But that serves a really important purpose for the chicken. So obviously, baby chicks need to stay very warm. We just talked about that in the previous question. So it would be not good for the continuation of the species for a mother hen to lay her eggs and to hatch them out in the middle of winter. It's too cold. So that decrease in lighting reduces her egg production, so she's not going to be hatching chicks when it's cold outside. If you've ever noticed first year layers, so chicks that you got in the spring, they generally lay eggs throughout their first winter with no reduction, and that's because they have lots of hormones. They're young pullets, lots of hormones, so they produce eggs that first winter, but then in subsequent winters they'll stop laying, and then as they age they just lay fewer eggs in general. Generally, it's only the first 3 years of a chicken's life that they are at their peak production. So my suggestion, what I would do if I was you, is I would just let them rest. Egg production is really stressful on their body, and in my opinion, they take that break for a reason. So I think that it is best to let them have that break. Let them rest, let their bodies recover. They just got done typically going through a molt. Winter is already stressful on them. So I like to just let them rest. So some ways to handle that, I guess. What I like to do is I store extra eggs in the summer. Typically in the summer, I have more eggs than I know what to do with. So I'll either keep them in the fridge. They can keep in the fridge for several months. Or you can freeze them. You can dehydrate them. Looking around online, there's lots of different egg preservation techniques, depending on what works for you. But if you're absolutely dead set, you want your chickens to lay throughout the winter, and that's your decision for your flock. A couple suggestions here. The one thing that is kind of necessary is to increase the amount of daylight. So like we mentioned, they need at least 15 hours of daylight. So you can hang up like those tube string lights, the ones that are in kind of the rubber tubing. And you can hang those up, plug them in, and put them on a timer so that your chickens are exposed to 15 hours total daylight. You could do something like solar lights or Christmas lights. Of course, anytime you're adding any sort of electricity into your coop, be very careful for fire purposes. I would not put up a heat lamp, which we'll talk more about actually in a question here in a little bit, but just a light source light to get to that 15 hours. Another thing to do would be to keep them warm, because cold is a stressor on the chickens, and anything cold is going to reduce laying. So there's ways to do that without heat. So you can wrap if they have an attached run, you can wrap that in some clear plastic. So that causes sort of like a greenhouse effect. So it will trap and absorb some heat. Another thing that you can do is to feed them a high protein feed in the winter that's 16%. Eggs are mostly protein, so that high protein feed could potentially help them lay more eggs. And then another kind of different solution would be to just include spring chicks. Add a couple spring chicks every year to your flock, and that way you should always have some eggs in your first winter. So hopefully that helps, and that answers your question. So our next question is from Bill.
Hi, I have a question about nipple feeders. I'm wondering if you can recommend a nipple feeder that stays automatically hooked up to the water. We had one before, but it is no longer available. And we would like to have a nipple feeder, the type that maybe you hang from the top of the pin or something like that, but it's basically always on. Thank you very much.
So I promise you, for those that are familiar with the store that we have, Bill's question was an honest one. It was not. It was not a listener question plant, genuine question. So Bill, thank you for asking. We actually do have a watering system that I think is exactly what you're looking for, and will be the solution to your problem. So we sell the Columbus Aqua horizontal poultry nipples, and they are a an automatic waterer basically that you can either screw into a bucket or onto a PVC pipe, and you can then make an autofill waterer, or if you're using PVC, you can have it so that it's hooked up to a garden hose, so that you would always have water available for your chickens. So these are a really great, inexpensive way to build a waterer. The Columbus Aqua ones, which are the ones that we sell in our store, they're the only ones that are not made in China. They're the original one that's been on the market. They've actually been in existence for about 25 years now. The Chinese lookalikes just recently came out, but unfortunately, the ones made in China are not the same quality and are prone to leaking and having some problems. So we actually offer a lifetime leak-free guarantee on ours. And again, you can put them on the side of a bucket or a 55-gallon drum or a PVC pipe. You can set it up so that it's either a high volume. So like we use a 55-gallon drum, works great. I only have to fill it up about once a month. If you did a PVC pipe sort of thing, you can use a pressure regulator and hook it up to a garden hose so it always has water supplied to it. Or you can use a 5-gallon bucket or container like that, and just fill it up on occasion, so that way they always have water available. Another really nice thing about these watering nipples is the nipple itself. It doesn't hold water in it because the barrel has a slant to it, so they're basically self-draining. So what I do on our 55-gallon drum is add a 250-watt submersible tank heater, and I don't have to worry about winter water, which is great. They have fresh water year-round, and it's it's a game changer for sure. So check out those Columbus Aqua horizontal poultry nipples. They're available in our store. I also have a blog post, which I'll include the link to, that talks about how to install them, how to train your chickens to use them, and I even have some project blueprints so that you can get some inspiration on how to make your own waterer. So hopefully that helps, and you can give your chickens some fresh water there. So our next question is from Barb.
Hi, I'd like to ask about your thoughts on chicken swings. So I made a chicken swing for my chickens, and I thought that they would love it. And I've read from, other places, other sources that they do, but my chickens don't use mine. I've tried setting them on it gently. I've tried putting treats on it, and they'll hop up long enough to eat the treat and then be gone. They don't use it regularly. And I'm wondering if maybe I should change it from just a single board to more of a platform swing, or what. I did initially start with it kind of low to the ground, and they would like hop over it and stuff. But as I gradually raised it, they had no interest in it. And I'm really kind of bummed because I thought that would be a really cool thing for them to have and spend time on, plus an extra roost. And I was hoping for comments or suggestions about whether it's even worth trying to modify it or don't bother with it. or maybe I'm doing something else wrong. I'd love your comments on this. Thanks.
Well, Barb, I would say rest assured you're not doing anything wrong. Like you, I saw all the cute videos online of the chickens on the chicken swings, and I've also seen, the chickens that play the xylophone. So I added a chicken swing to my run as well. Thought they would love it, and they don't. they hate it. They will either run around it or hop over it, and it really does nothing but get in my way when I'm trying to clean their perch. I think that it's just one of those things where some flocks are just fortunate enough to have an individual chicken that, or maybe a few chickens that like to sit on them. But generally speaking, chickens aren't really a roosting bird. They'll roost up at night, but typically they want to spend their time on the ground and foraging and pecking. They don't really, sit in a tree all day or perch kind of thing. So I don't know that it's really the most compatible with sort of normal chicken behavior, if that makes sense. So I think you're kind of in the same boat that I am, where we have one and they just unfortunately don't like it. I don't really think that there is a solution for it. I think it's just one of those things, unfortunately. So before we go on to our next question, I just wanted to let you guys know that another really great way to get a hold of me, in addition to submitting your Q&A for upcoming podcast episodes, is to send me a text. I have a texting platform that I can answer questions easily, and sometimes I don't get to them right away because unfortunately I am a little bit busy, but I get to everybody eventually, and I do my best to answer any questions that come through and send you to the most applicable resource or answer your questions as best as I can. So the best way to do that is to text me, and my number there is 719-292-3207. Again, 719-292-3207. And I'll put that in the show notes as well, so you don't need to hurry up and write it down. But what you can do is send me a text there, ask whatever questions you'd like. And also, if you would like to receive podcast updates, new episodes, and like the request for questions that I sent out for this episode, I do that through the text message platform. So when you text me, just text the word podcast, and I'll make sure that you're added to that, to the podcast topics that I send out. So my next question is a very common one from the Blue Truck Farm.
Hi, Nicole. This is Blue Truck Farm. Question I have for you on chickens. What's the best way to introduce new chickens into the flock? I've had some issues in the past year, and I'm wondering if there's a better way to do it, both from a chick perspective and also from a pluck perspective. If you could let me know, that'd be great. Thank you.
So I know that this is a question that is a stressful one for all folks. I know I've been through this on more than one occasion, and I absolutely hate introducing new birds into my flock. I don't know who it's more stressful for, me or the chickens, but this is a question that I actually get very regularly in my email and my text message platform, and I'm working on a blog post for this. I don't know that it'll be done by the time this episode comes out, but I am working on that. I do hear you guys, I know that this is a bummer. So I have, this is probably going to be my longest response to the Q&A here, and hopefully I don't ramble too much, but hopefully I answer your question and give you some tips that can be useful for you. So the very first thing that I would say is, if you're adding new birds to your flock, absolutely make sure that you quarantine them first. Bare minimum, quarantine them for 13 days. Texas A&M actually recommends quarantining them for 6 weeks. And I would tend to agree with the longer side of things. The last time that I added birds to my flock, I quarantined them for 30 days and thought everything was fine. Put them in with my flock, and come to find out the new birds had a respiratory illness that didn't present itself in those 30 days. So I definitely wish that I had them separated for 6 weeks, because it was a nightmare. And the unfortunate thing about respiratory illness in birds, it's kind of one of those things that once they have it, it can show up again at any time. So lesson learned there. We all make mistakes, right? So quarantine them. Not going to be so much of an issue if you have chicks, but especially if you are getting adult birds. So I found an article, and I'll include the link, but this is from Dr. Jackie Jacob from the University of Kentucky, and I just wanted to read a quote here, and then expand upon it, because I think that this is going to be really helpful. So the quote in this article reads, birds that normally form a social hierarchy, such as chickens, usually attack a new bird of the same species or breed that is introduced into the pen or cages. In order to develop a pecking order, birds must be able to recognize individuals in a flock. This ability allows them to identify and peck only those hens lower in the pecking order. It is not clear what clues chickens are using in order to identify individual chickens within a flock. Research suggests that laying hens are able to recognize about 30 individuals. This social structure, developed in small groups, begins to break down in a flock of 30 to 60 birds. When there are more than 60 birds in a flock, the chickens become less aggressive and more tolerant of each other. So my takeaway from this is to get more chickens, have at least 60 birds. But obviously that's not realistic. But the reason that I read this and that I think that it's important is because it goes on to talk about an experiment that they did where they had an established flock, and they had a chicken that had a comb that apparently kind of flopped to one side. They pulled that chicken from the flock, took that comb and flopped it over to the other side and put the chicken back in, and they found that that chicken was then pecked on, because they didn't recognize the bird. And so they found that when they so that happened to just that one individual hen. It all of a sudden didn't look the same. They didn't identify it, so they harassed it. So what they found was, when they removed a large number of established hens from this flock and altered their appearance, and then put that large number of birds back into the existing flock. These are birds that were once familiar and established in the pecking order. When they did this with a large number of birds instead of just an individual bird, the flock was able to establish a new pecking order. So I think the important takeaway from that is, if you're introducing new birds to the flock, don't just introduce one bird at a time. If you can, introduce as many new birds at the same time. So one bird getting added into a flock of a dozen or however many is really going to be targeted. But if you're introducing 5 birds into a flock of a dozen, there's going to be more disruption of that social hierarchy, and it's not just one bird that's going to be targeted. Then all of the new ones are going to be targeted. But the benefit of that is, instead of everybody going after one bird, that kind of harassment's going to be distributed through those 5 new birds. And so that's going to help lessen the overall pressure. And so if you're adding chicks, one of the things that I would recommend is to wait until the chicks are the same size as the adults, or the existing members of the flock. And so that's going to really help them blend in, and that way it kind of levels the playing field than if you were to introduce some juveniles into a flock of adult birds. Another thing that you could consider if you are getting flocks, if you have a broody hen that might take the chicks in, if you feel comfortable with them being raised by that broody hen, that's an option, because that way they're pretty much immediately established into that flock, because mama hen will make sure that everybody accepts her babies and she'll protect them. And then just some kind of other general tips, nothing really in a specific order, but I would make sure that your coop and your run is large enough to prevent overcrowding. So the bigger space that you have to introduce those new birds, the better, because everybody can kind of find their own corner to get away from each other if needed. And overcrowding in general can just lead to some problems, even in an established flock. Another thing that I would do is add a second feeder and waterer during that adjustment period. One thing that happens when new birds are bullied is they're often chased away from the feeder and water. So if you can add a second food and watering station, that'll make sure that the new birds will also be able to eat and drink while the dominant established birds do as well. One thing that I like to do is I'll add some sort of like a pile of twigs or some sort of structure that the birds can kind of hide behind. So if they start to really get harassed, they have a way to get away from the birds. Another thing that I'll do is I'll add sort of a couple of new perches. Obviously the chickens like to stay on the ground, so by adding a number of perches, those new birds, if they're getting harassed, they can kind of get up on the perch. And most of the time, if they're up on that perch, they're kind of left alone. So I found that really kind of helps give them somewhere to just to take a breather. What would really be ideal if possible, and I know that this isn't something that can really be done in a lot of situations, but if you could divide the coop and run, depending on whether or not you have them attached or not. Some people, just have a coop that opens up into the prairie, while other people, like myself, have a coop with an attached run. So that's kind of where I'm going with that. If you can add a partition so that the new birds have their own, they're divided and they can have their own part of the coop and the run where the other birds can't get to them, that will really help them to start to associate each other. And then after a few weeks, then you can work to integrate them. But instead of just throwing a new strange bird into the flock, if you can have that partition where like wire so that they can see them, the established flock can see the new birds, that will also really help those chickens learn that's a new flock member, if you will. And then when you finally go to introduce them, what I like to do is to add those new birds into the coop at night. Chickens don't see very well at night, so you can take the new birds and just place them on the perch into that new into the coop at night, and that will kind of help. So in the morning, they're just like, "Oh, hey, you're new," and that seems to help with that adjustment. Some other suggestions would be to allow the flock to free range as you're introducing these new birds. So that gives lots of space for for the birds to interact without being confined into a run or a coop. So it's sort of like that the thought process behind the partition. They can interact, but they're not necessarily confined with each other. If you have one individual bird that's just being especially aggressive, you can remove that bird, and that also kind of upsets that hierarchy. So that bird, if it's being the biggest bully, it's typically the alpha, whether or not it's a rooster or a head hen or however your flock dynamic is. So if you take out that main bird, then then there's that whole shift of the pecking order. The social structure all of a sudden has been interrupted. And so that will, the existing flock will be kind of preoccupied with that. Oh my gosh, we don't have a leader now. And I think that really helps take off the pressure of the new birds. But also, if one bird's being really aggressive and really harassing the new birds, taking that bird out can alleviate some of the stress on the new birds. And then, of course, if anybody is injured in the process, make sure that you removed that injured bird right away and treat any injuries as needed. As you may be familiar with chickens, they tend to be cannibalistic, for lack of better terms. And once they see blood, they're just going to keep pecking at it. So if somebody is injured and bleeding, you'll want to make sure that you take them out and get them treated so that they're not further targeted. Another source of some flock fighting, if you will, is multiple roosters. If you have a very large flock or a very large area for them to roam, you may be able to get away with multiple roosters. But generally speaking, you're just going to be able to have one. That's just how it is. So I would not recommend trying to add a new rooster into an existing flock, unless maybe if it was an immature rooster, you might be able to get away with it. But as soon as that new rooster becomes mature, it's going to be an issue. So it's something I would just probably avoid in general. If you are moving or changing coops, then one really good way to introduce new birds to an existing flock is to move everybody into a new place at the same time. So when you take an existing flock and your new birds and put them both into a new place, that's nobody's home ground, nobody's territory. So the chickens are the existing flock isn't going to be so inclined to be as territorial because it's new to them too. So I think that's probably a less likely scenario, because most of the time people aren't going to be moving their entire flock into a new place. But if that is something that you're doing, then that'd be a really good time to introduce them to each other. And then my last tip, I guess, would be just to understand that unfortunately the pecking order is natural. It sucks. Nobody likes it. It's stressful for everybody. But there's no point in spending your whole day out there and breaking up every little tiff that happens in the flock. It's necessary. It has to be done. As long as nobody's bleeding and getting hurt to the point that blood's being drawn, it's just something that needs to be accepted, unfortunately. And within a period of time, everybody, it'll stop eventually. So I hope that answers your question. Again, I'll have a blog post coming out soon. I don't have an exact date, but soon, that covers this in more detail. And hopefully that answers your question. So our next question here is from Phyllis.
Yes, what is the best and cheapest store-bought chicken food / mix? I just wanted to know. Tractor Supply, to me, doesn't have a very good selection. Thanks. Bye.
So typically speaking, I would say that best doesn't necessarily coincide with least expensive. I've personally tried a variety of different feeds that are available. Here in my area, we have both a Tractor Supply and a Big R. And for a while we had a local feed mill, and I preferred to use the local feed mill. That was the cheapest food available because it was made locally, and it was great to support a local small business. But unfortunately, they ended up closing down, so that option was no longer available. So I would say that if you live somewhere where you do have a mill, that's going to be your cheapest. It's going to be even cheaper if you can buy in bulk. Most people don't really have the place to store, 1,000 pounds of food sold in bulk. But if that's something that you can work out, that is going to be your absolute cheapest option. I would say that some of the best feeds are, of course, the most expensive. I would say that some of the best feeds that I've come across would be the Big Sky organic feed. That's something that I personally use for fermenting, but it's expensive. It's $25 for 50 pounds. But when you ferment food, it's a little bit goes a long way. And I do have a blog post that talks about fermented food, if you'd like to get more information on that. Scratch and Peck Feeds also makes a really great food as well for chicks and layers. But otherwise, I've tried the cheaper brands at Tractor Supply, and I personally don't like them. I found that the chickens, they were smellier. Their poo was smellier with it. And they just didn't seem to be as healthy after their molt. Their feathers didn't really come in as nice. And I just didn't really like it. So personally, what I use from Tractor Supply is the Nutrina NatureWise layer feed. I use Crumbles, and it's the one in the red bag. That's just what I use. But I don't really know that answered your question, but hopefully that gave you some guidance, I guess. And so our next question is going to be from Abigail.
Hi, so my question is on frostbitten chicken combs. What can you do to prevent it, and what can you do to fix it? Because the other day when it was really cold here, our chicken's combs are now frostbitten.
So I can understand, Abigail. I'm assuming that you probably live in Texas. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm assuming you do, and frostbite is a challenge. So again, from the I have another resource from Dr. Jackie Jacob from the University of Kentucky that talks about frostbite in chickens, and I can include that link for you. But just to kind of give you a summary, as far as preventing frostbite, and I'll talk about treatment in a minute. So, preventing it, obviously, in your situation, unfortunately, it's a little too late to prevent it. The damage is already done. But going forward, to try and prevent something like that from happening again in the future, frostbite is generally due to moisture in the coop. That's pretty much what causes it. So if your chickens got frostbite, I can pretty much tell you that your coop is not properly ventilated, and potentially you're also are having some additional moisture sources in the coop. So here in southern Colorado, we got down to -20 during this recent snowstorm, and I have no heat lamps, nothing like that. It's just the chickens in the coop, and I did not have any frostbite on any of my birds, including the leghorns that have a really big comb. So I'm not telling you this to gloat, but just to tell you that it is very feasible for chickens to live or to be exposed to a very cold temperature and not end up with frostbite. So dry bedding and proper ventilation are an absolute must. In my chicken coop, there's just a dirt floor, and I have ventilation, just some holes cut with some like those vent register covers that are up high. So you want ventilation up above the birds as they're in the coop at night and they go to the bathroom and they breathe and all that. They actually release a lot of moisture, and that moisture needs somewhere to escape. If the coop is retaining that moisture, you're going to have frostbite. So another thing would be to make sure that you don't have a waterer in your coop. Again, that's going to be a source of additional moisture. So I would encourage you to take a look at your coop and add some ventilation as needed. Another thing that you can do that I don't do yet, but this is in my summer plans here, the deep litter method. The deep litter method puts off some heat in the winter as things break down. So that's a way to safely heat your coop. It's not a ton of heat, but it's some heat. And another thing that I would recommend, the chicken nipple waterers that I mentioned earlier. That's of course what I use, and the water's out in the run. But one thing that I really like about that, versus an open water, in addition to all the other benefits like preventing disease, because open water is one of the biggest cause of disease transfer and respiratory infection in chickens, is these nipple waters keep the chicken's wattles dry. So typically you're going to see frostbite on combs, wattles, and toes. So the water is a really good way to keep their wattles from getting wet and then getting frozen. As far as toes, in order to prevent frostbite on toes, you want to make sure that you're using a perch that, as the chickens sleep, they can kind of tuck in their toes and their feathers. So if you're using a 2x4, you want to make sure that it's not the narrow edge the chickens are perching on, but the wide edge. So turn the 2x4 on the side so that it's the wider side that they're perching on. And the reason for that is when it's the narrow side that's up, the chicken's toes curl around that 2x4 so far that when they puff up and they rest their feathers over their toes, the tips of their toes are still going to show because they can't get those covered up by their feathers. So the flatter the perch, the better for them to be able to protect their feet. I hope that makes sense. And then, I know that heat lamps, of course, you can heat a coop with a heat lamp, but I will tell you, again, we had negative 20 degree temperatures with no frostbite. The heat isn't going to necessarily prevent the frostbite. If you're still having a moisture issue, the heat is unlikely or could potentially not heat the coop enough to prevent frostbite. I saw lots of posts on Facebook where people had heat plates or heat lamps, and their birds still ended up with frostbite because it still got cold and there's still too much of a moisture issue. If it's negative 20 outside, a heat lamp's not going to heat your coop up to 85 degrees or whatever it is. So know that. And then I will tell you, for those that are new to listening, I know I mentioned this in the past, but I spent about a decade of my life as a firefighter, and I will tell you that I do not use heat lamps because they are an extreme fire danger. I don't care how well you secure the coop, or rather secure the light to the coop. It's not necessarily that every time that the light falls and starts a fire. Sometimes it's mice that chew cords. Sometimes it's just other things. So I for not only for the fire danger, strongly recommend avoiding a heat source, whether it's a heat lamp, oil heater, or a heat panel. Another reason for that is that if you do have a heat source in your coop and your birds are used to that heat source, and all of a sudden you lose power like they were having issues with in Texas, that sudden temperature change will kill your birds. So I can't caution you enough on heat lamps and heat sources. But I will say, if you don't want to listen to me, it's your choice. But I would, if you're dead set on using a heat source, I would recommend a heat panel instead of a heat light or an actual heater. I am a big fan of sweeter heaters. They're a radiant heat, so it doesn't heat up the temperature in the coop, but the birds can get next to it, and it's a radiant heat, so it warms it warms up the bird, not the ambient air. And they are known for being the safest option, but again, no electrical source in your coop is going to be 100% safe. So I would consider checking them out. Again, I have one and they work well. That's what I typically would use for my brooders, for my chicks. I know that one thing that's pretty popular online is putting Vaseline on coops and wattles. While that can work in some more mild temperatures, it's not necessarily the most effective if you're having some ventilation issues. So I guess you could, it's not going, as far as I know, it's not going to hurt anything to use it. I need to do some more research on that though. So I can't tell you 100%, but I know that it is a common thing. But you're more, you're better off fixing the ventilation problem in a coop. So one thing that I will add a link in the description, I did find the University of Pennsylvania has a wintertime ventilation webinar specifically for small-scale poultry backyard chicken flocks. And it's a little over an hour. It's an hour and 10 minutes. And they go into much more detail about setting up your chicken coop to have great ventilation. And that'll really help with preventing frostbite. So they take what I said and expand much more on it over a period of an hour. I previewed it. It's a really great webinar. Again, I'll include the link. So I would recommend taking a look at that. As far as treatment for frostbite, there's different treatment for comb injuries, comb and wattle injuries, I guess, and for feet injuries. So starting with treatment for frostbitten combs after the frostbite has already occurred. If you just found that your bird has frostbite, you want to rewarm the frozen area slowly. And by slowly, like take the bird inside, either in the house or in a garage or somewhere that's warmer. Don't use a blow dryer. Don't use warm water. Don't rub it. You don't want to do any active rewarming. Just move the bird into a warmer place and let that tissue thaw out. Just slowly. That's the best way to do it. Don't cut off any of the blackened skin that happens from the frostbite unless that skin is infected. If you cut it off, then that's going to make the bird more susceptible to infection. If you find any blisters, make sure you leave those blisters alone. I know that they look gross, but the squishy stuff inside of the blister is sort of a natural Band-Aid, and it's going to actually help heal the injury. So you want to make sure that you don't intentionally pop those or remove them. And it can take up to 4 to 6 weeks for that tissue to heal. And know that the tissue that's turned black, it's dead tissue. It's not going to come back. It's eventually, hopefully, going to just kind of shrivel up and fall off. So don't be surprised when that happens. So basically, in a nutshell, move the bird to a warmer area and just kind of leave the injury alone and let it heal naturally. If it does end up infected, then you'll want to treat that infection. Make sure you don't use hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide is going to damage the fresh tissue, and never use Neosporin that has pain reliever in it, because that pain reliever component can actually be potentially fatal to chickens. So you can use just plain ointment, but never the ointment with pain reliever. And as far as treatment for feet, and just so you know, these treatment options are from that Dr. Jackie Jacob article, and I can include that link here also. So for treatment of feet, she recommends to soak the feet in slightly warm water, not hot water, but slightly warm water, to slowly bring back the temperature to normal. And then you should keep the chicken out of further cold. So once you've warmed up the chicken's toes, you don't really want to put the chicken back outside in the cold. That thawing and refreezing will cause more damage in the long run. And then again, same with toes. There's really nothing that can be done at that point. Unfortunately, the damage has already been done. Anything that's turned black is dead tissue. It's not going to come back, and eventually it's just going to shrivel up and fall off. So if you have a chicken whose toes are blackened, that blackened part's going to fall off, and then you might have to make some modifications for chickens that might have some issues perching and things like that, unfortunately. So just something to be aware of. So our next question here is from Phyllis once again.
Yes, what is your take on feeding small amounts of cheese to baby chicks?
So Phyllis, I would respectfully say that I wouldn't be feeding cheese to chicks, just because that's not really the best treat for chickens in general, but especially for chicks, because they are still young and developing. If you're wanting to give your chicks a treat, so that you can kind of work on hand taming them, or you just enjoy giving them a little special snack, I would recommend sticking to something more natural. Mealworms are a really great treat for chicks. You can also give them, maybe something like some berries or seeds, or I would just stick to something more natural. Typically, milk products aren't really the best for chickens. They're not the most equipped to process milk products. And then I would also mention that anytime you're feeding chicks anything other than their regular chick feed, they are going to need a chick grit. If you're just feeding your chicks the regular chick starter feed, they don't need grit. But anytime they're eating something other than the feed, they do need that grit to help break it up, whether it's the cheese or mealworms or something else. Mealworms are really easy to raise. I do have a complete article on raising mealworms. Very inexpensive, easy to raise. It's a great high protein treat for chicks that help them develop properly, gives them lots of vitamins and nutrients. So I would say that I'd probably avoid the cheese and stick to something like mealworms instead. Our next question is from Pat.
Hi, Nicole. This is Pat. We're going to have some chickens out on the grassy prairie near Elizabeth. And my question is, can I allow them to run around in the open in the grass, or will I lose them to predators? I'm wondering if I need to absolutely have some sort of overhead wire netting, fencing, so that they're completely enclosed, mainly for birds of prey. Thank you.
So that's a great question, Pat. I know that that's a very common problem. In our recent backyard chicken survey that we sent out to folks, predators were the biggest concern, with hawks actually being the most common problem predator. I've definitely had issues with this as well. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go. So I'll go ahead and let you know. I'm going to try that again. I'm screwing this up now. So I'll let you know some things that I've come up with along the way, but I would also recommend that you take a listen to our Predator podcast episode with Dr. Matt Springer. He's a wildlife biologist and does a lot of education on backyard chickens and predator management. So that's going to really give you a more detailed answer, but just kind of some key points that I can offer you in a short period of time. If you live in a more rural area, I would add some guinea fowl to your flock. I love to use guinea fowl as a watchdog. They're much more aware of what's going on around them, and they're much more inclined to see danger coming before the chickens usually do. And also, if you can have a rooster, roosters make really good protectors. But that might not necessarily be an option where you're at. I'm not sure how much land or your rules against chickens or roosters and anything like that. Another thing, if you can, and I realize that this isn't really an option for most people, but a livestock guardian dog, of course, that's their job, is to protect your birds. So that would be a really great choice if you can. Otherwise, what I would do is I would provide the chickens some things to get away from the predators. So for overhead predator protection, you're going to want something that the entire flock will fit underneath. So something like a half of a drainage pipe sort of thing, like obviously a large drainage pipe, so that the birds can get underneath there. Or if you can build some sort of like a platform structure that they would fit underneath, something like that would be great, because as long as it's tall enough for the chickens to fit under, a hawk that's coming in to get the chickens isn't going to fly underneath a 2-foot surface to get a chicken, or a 2-foot roof sort of thing. But I would also add, in addition to the overhead protection, some perches or structures that are high for chickens to get away from ground predators. Even if you live in a more urban place, there's always the chance of coyotes or stray dogs. So you want something high enough that the birds can get up onto and away from something like a dog. Overhead protection, if you can provide it, is great. Something like maybe a chicken tractor, so that way the chickens are confined, but you can move the tractor around so they can forage different areas. If you have a run that you're going to confine them in, maybe that's attached to your coop or something like that. For example, in my setup, I have a chicken coop with a large attached run, and I only free range the birds when I can be out with them, because we do have a predator issue, especially coyotes. So when they're in the run, that run has a roof. It of course has sides, and then it also has a metal skirting. So on the bottom of the run, on top, horizontally on top of the ground, is some wire so that a digging animal can't dig into the coop. We cover all of these in more detail in that predator podcast. So that would kind of be my recommendation for those. Or like I said, just be out with them when you do free range them. I would not recommend things like scare tactics like hanging CDs or streamers or, owl, those like little owl, fake decoy owls that you put out. They're not going to work. They might work for a few days, but eventually the predators are going to realize that it's not a threat, and they're just going to get used to it. So it's not a long-term fix. And then I would just remind people listening, when it comes to birds of prey, that they are a federally protected species, and it is illegal to harm or kill them. So whereas you can shoot things like coyotes legally, although it's not recommended, and we cover that also in that predator podcast, it is federally illegal to kill birds of prey. It's protected by the Migratory Species Act. So please don't shoot them. So I hope, Pat, that answers your question. Predators are a challenge for sure. So next we are going to hear from Kellie from the Chicory Pond Farm.
Hi, this is Kellie from Chicory Pond Farm. I was just thinking that I would love to know what are some recommendations for a more sustainable diet for chickens that you can grow at home. Smaller farmers, I have 10 acres, can grow on their own. What would give them a complete and balanced diet? I'm looking at things like sunflowers, peas, raisins, mealworms, but I would love some more insight. I also grow millet and amaranth, but yeah, I'm still kind of in the baby stages of researching that. So I would love some more insight into what are some good things to grow to start being able to provide more food over the winter for my chickens. I do, free range them and pasture them. In the summer, I do have some in tractors, but they move around, they get bugs, they get grass. But over the winter, we're covered in snow. So I'd like to start growing some things to help reduce our feed costs. So that's what I would like to know.
Kellie, I appreciate your question. I would say it's definitely has several layers to it. So I guess I would answer each layer as sort of its own question. So I would say that as far as being more sustainable with growing chicken feed, I think that's going to be a challenge. I'm not sure how many chickens you have, but I don't know that with 10 acres that you could grow everything that you would need to be able to create the proper nutritional mix of chicken feed on a large scale. You might be able to grow enough to get you a few months of food, but I don't know that the cost and the time involved and everything would be worth it. And then getting the ratios correct to make sure that you have the right amount of calcium and the right amount of protein and all of that. I think it could be a challenge. So it would be interesting. It'd be interesting to see if you're able to do that. I know that the store-bought foods, or the ones that they sell at the feed store, might not necessarily be the best because of corn or soy or however you choose to feed your chickens. But I would say that those feeds are nutritionally balanced, and that's one of the biggest challenges on making your own food blend, whether it's buying the ingredients individually and mixing it yourself or growing them. So I guess personally, I would probably just stick to the store-bought layer feed or chicken feed. But there are definitely ways that you can offset food costs and provide your chickens with a variety of food in winter. So I know we talked about it earlier, but one thing that I would recommend for winter would be mealworms. That's a good high protein feed. It's really easy to raise them. They're next to free. There's really not a whole lot of expense involved. Like I mentioned earlier, I have a complete a blog post about it, so you can go from not knowing what to do to having a successful mealworm farm with that post, and I would definitely check that out if that's something that you're interested in. They can't just live off mealworms, but it's a great way to supplement their feed. Another thing that I like to do is I have a seed blend that I offer in my store, and it's called the Essential Nutrients Seed Blend. And I sell it in a little bag, and it's meant to be sprouted in like a seedling tray or in a flat, and then you can trim off the tops of the seedlings as they're growing, or depending on how far you want to let them grow, and then you can give that to your chickens. So that's a really great way to give them kind of a snack, but also some green stuff to eat in the winter when when, like you said, all of the grass and things are dead. That seed mix, I did a lot of research when I put it together. It's really easy to grow. It's really inexpensive. You get a lot for the price. It lasts a long time. And it has a really high germination rate. And I definitely like to grow that for them. I have a post on my website. I'm not a huge fan of just doing like wheatgrass. There's a lot of research that shows that wheatgrass is sort of insufficient in nutrients. It doesn't really offer a whole lot of benefits, and I talk about that more in the blog post. So that's why I like the seed blend that I researched, because it has a variety of different seeds in it that actually do provide some nutrient supplement. It increases the omega-3 in your eggs and things like that. So definitely something to consider there. A couple other things that I would recommend for just general offsetting of food costs, and I know that I mentioned it earlier, but to expand on it a little bit more, is fermenting feed. I'm a big fan of fermenting feed. As much as I am a fan of it, I'll be honest, I don't do it year round, just because there are times that I don't have the time to invest into it, so I'm not able to do it. The great thing about fermenting feed is I guess I should probably tell you a little bit more about what fermenting feed is before I get into the benefits. Simply put, what you would do is take some feed and put it in a container. You can do something small scale, like put it in a mason jar, or something larger scale and use buckets. So it's something that you can completely replace their food, like their regular layer crumbles with. You can ferment any kind of food, whether it's their regular layer feed, the big sky feed that I mentioned earlier. You can even ferment chicken scratch or mash, any sort of chicken food you can ferment. So the process, in a nutshell, is to add some feed into a container, cover it with water. The feed will expand as it absorbs the water. After a couple days, it will ferment, and then you can feed it to your chickens. And it's really great for a couple of reasons. Because that food absorbs the water and physically expands, 1 cup of dry food turns into about 1.5 cups of wet food. So if you just think about a volume, on a volume level, your chickens, if their stomach normally holds 1/2 cup of food, let's say, I'm not really sure, I'm just making that up, 1/2 cup of dry food, let's say that's what they normally eat. Well, that's really less when it's expanded. So that 1 cup of dry food, if our chicken stomach holds 1/2 cup, would feed 2 chickens, right? Well, 1 cup of dry food becomes 1.5 cups of wet food. So that 1 cup of dry food would then feed 3 chickens, assuming that that's really how much chickens eat. So just that expansion thing, your food will go a lot further. But also the process of fermenting it adds in good bacteria. So you're giving them probiotics and things that really support their gut health. And then the fermenting process also breaks down some seed protection that some chemicals that the seeds have that protect them, basically. So once that seed coating is broken down, the chickens are actually able to absorb more nutrients from that feed. So not only does your food go further, but it's more easily digested. It gives them more nutrients, and it really adds a lot of probiotics. So fermenting feed, if you're looking to stretch your food costs, fantastic. I can't recommend it enough. And then my only other recommendation would be to feed your chickens kitchen scraps. So as you're cooking in the kitchen, save your food scraps, save any leftovers that didn't get eaten, things like that. And that's a really great free thing to give your chickens. Free as in, of course you already purchased it. And then so you can just give those to your chickens and use that to help offset some feed costs. So I do have a source on my website I have a post about fermenting feed. I have a post about growing mealworms, and I also have a post called the ultimate lists of things that you can and can't feed your chickens. So you can look and see what food scraps are safe for your chickens. Spoiler alert, they're pretty much most everything's okay. But there are some things that you shouldn't feed your chickens. So I hope that answers your question, and that can help offset some of your food costs. So next, we will hear from Allison.
Hi, my name is Allison, and I'm wondering, I know that chickens need more protein in the winter, but is it bad for them to have a lot of protein in the summer as well? That's it. Thank you very much.
So Allison, this was actually, I thought, a really interesting question, because it was honestly not something I had thought about. And the research that I did on it was very interesting. So I found an article from the Alabama Extension Service, and it's titled Nutrition for Backyard Chicken Flocks. And I will just read a portion of the article here, and then I think that'll pretty much answer your question. So here we go. The article says, during summer, feed consumption tends to decrease as environmental temperature increases, so protein, energy, vitamins, and minerals must be increased in the diet. In winter, the opposite is true. Birds eat more to maintain their body heat. Growing birds require more protein than do mature chickens. In addition, heavy meat-type chickens require more protein than do lighter egg-laying strains. There are also seasonal effects on feed consumption. For example, a hen may consume up to 340 kilocalories of metabolizable energy per day during winter to keep warm. But in summer, she may consume only 260 kilocalories of metabolizable energy during the day. Therefore, during summer, when temperatures are high, a higher protein feed level should be fed. During winter, when chickens are low, during winter when temperatures are low, a lower protein diet can be fed without affecting egg production. So I think that pretty much should answer your question, other than the fact I can't pronounce metabolizable. So in summer, the chickens aren't eating as much, but their egg production is at a max. So that higher protein feed is actually more beneficial to them in the summer than it is in the winter. While in the winter they are staying warm, they're not laying those eggs, so the higher protein needs really aren't there. So the article goes on to recommend a 15 to 19% feed for the summer. And I'll include the link to that article so you can read that if you'd like. But I would also just point out that if you free range your birds, they're likely getting some additional protein from foraging and eating insects and different things that they come across. And also that higher protein feed is really helpful as they're molting. So I think that most people understand that eggs are mostly made up of protein, so they need high protein feed for the egg production. But also feathers are almost entirely protein. So if you can increase their protein intake, whether it's by giving them like a feather fixer feed, say that 10 times fast, feeding them mealworms or different things like that, that's also going to really help with their feather production during the molt. And so our last question for this Q&A episode is from Amy.
Hi, Nicole. This is Amy. I live in Illinois, and biggest problem I'm having right now is with the melt in my chicken yard. I have my chickens outdoors, and there's a lot of water which they are drinking, and it's really not clean at all. And I'm kind of wondering what you would recommend for materials to absorb that water if it's good. We don't know if winter's over here, so there could be a potential freeze on top of that.
Thank you so much for your question, Amy. Another question. I feel your pain. We don't get a ton of snow here, but our soil here is a clay soil. So when things get, when the snow starts to melt and stuff, it can get pretty messy around here too. So to expand on your chickens drinking the water, that's just sort of, that's just a chicken thing. I have found that it doesn't matter how fresh their water is. If you just cleaned it, chickens, for some silly reason, will always drink the dirtiest water available. I don't know why. I honestly don't know why, but it's just kind of a quirk of theirs, I guess. But as far as the mud and things in their run, probably not something that you could do right now. But once this all clears up, I would go through and add sand to the coop in the run or wherever your mud issues are. The sand will help that a lot, keep the area a lot drier. So as far as right now, I can't really say that there's a good product or suggestion to necessarily absorb all of that moisture. Things like straw that you could put in there, the problem with that is the straw can then mold and then they can get a respiratory infection. I'll probably mispronounce it, but it's aspergillosis, something like that anyways. So I think that the best thing to do right now is just to kind of accept it, I guess, and then once things dry out, add that sand. Or you could do pea gravel too, but I don't like to do pea gravel as much because the chickens do kind of like to dig and stuff, and they can't really dig in the pea gravel. So another thing that you can do, I'm a huge fan of a First Saturday Lime. Highly recommend it. And I actually have a coupon code where you can save 20% off your first order. I'll include the link to that in the description. That's the easiest way for me to share that coupon with you. But I definitely recommend checking out First Saturday Lime. I use that product everywhere. And I do have a post about First Saturday Lime coming out as well, so you can learn more about how to use it and how I use it around our farm here. Well, that was all of the questions for today. I hope that you guys found this useful. I'm sorry this episode was a little bit like 3 times longer than most of them, but I just wanted to make sure that I got all of the questions that came in for this episode answered. If you guys did find this useful, please send me more questions, and I would love to keep doing these. As long as the questions come in, I would love to do at least one of these a month, and potentially do both one on backyard chickens and another one on beekeeping. So please send your questions over. Again, this is on YouTube, and if you're listening on YouTube, it's also available on all of the major podcast players. And then if you have any other questions, please feel free to shoot me a text, and that number will be in the description as well. And thank you so much for joining me for another episode, and we'll see you again next week.